Hello and welcome to part 5 of the series Is There Any Meaning to Life? In this series, we have been talking about a hypothetical situation of an ant colony living on this paper airplane, which represents human beings living in the universe. It's just easier to think of an airplane and ants than it is to wrap our whole minds around the universe, which is too big for anyone to really comprehend. If you have not watched part 1 through 4 up to this point, I recommend you do so that you can be on par with everyone else here. What we've been talking about so far is how this airplane must have come to be, where it came from, and also the issue of morality, of right and wrong. Is it absolute, or where did it come from? So now the topic for today is, okay, so everything we've learned, where does this leave us? By studying the laws of nature, we have concluded that either someone or something either made this paper airplane or that through some scientific explanation, it made itself. Through studying the law of nature, in this case we've been talking about ant nature or human nature, there seems to be a standard of right behavior that we all feel obliged to adhere to, whether we like it or not, and that we could not have created this standard itself. Therefore, we find that it must be made by someone or something higher than ourselves. It is here that the idea of God comes into play. Up to this point, we haven't even mentioned God, but this is where God comes in. The ants that assume that someone or something had to have created this airplane also assume that this same entity must have also created the standard of moral behavior. For if they created the thing, they must have the right to make rules about it. And since, whether we like it or not, everyone deep down believes in this code of right and wrong, it follows that the entity that created the standard must itself be good. Now, by good, I do not mean soft, indulgent, or sympathetic. The moral law itself is not soft. It is hard as nails. It tells you the correct thing to do regardless of how hard or difficult or painful it is to do so. But when we look upon our world, or when the ants look upon their little paper airplane, they notice that the world overall does not adhere to this code, even though we know that we ought to. Something has gone wrong, and so therefore, some ants question if the entity that created it could really be good after all. I mean, I'm not very good at making paper airplanes, so it does look flawed, but they claim that the world that they live on is simply too messed up or that it's too unjust. But how are they getting this idea of just or unjust? The word just is a comparative term. You cannot call something crooked unless you know what straight looks like. So what are they comparing the world to when they call it unjust? If the world is bad, then why do they, being part of the world, find themselves in such a violent reaction against it? Of course, then at this point, they can try to explain away this idea of justice by saying it is nothing more than what personally appeals to them at the time, what they like in that moment. But this is an argument that we've already addressed in previous videos. But in doing this, by saying justice is simply just something they like or something that appeals to them or which is convenient to them, then their argument against a good God collapses as well. For the argument depended upon saying that the world was too unjust to warrant a good God, not that it simply did not appeal to their personal preference. Thus, in the act of denying a good God, you find yourself having to admit that at least one thing, that justice exists. And now we are come first full circle, back again to the original argument. Now everyone is on board with the fact that the standard of behavior is real and it is truth. Stay tuned for part 6.